The summit. Hot, all the lug nuts are falling off. So we're back to getting a U-Haul, hopefully. Pretty soon we'll be on our way again. Meanwhile, we have a cleanup crew.
And basically it's just
everybody doing their part. Gets unload this whole thing. Can you imagine? This could have been all over the roadway. There'd have been no food, no nothing left, let alone all that wood to hit other vehicles. Whew. Girls are on the trip. And over here a few more. Now it's a weight game. One of my favorite places in the world, Mona Lake. We had just come through a snowstorm where they were plowing the road ahead of us for quite a while. Over here's the crew after, let's see, the trailer breakdown. Then we had the explosion of the fire extinguisher. Claude is pulling out all stops on his tricks for the trip. Here's Annie Fanny. Yeah. Anyway, it's beautiful. Just beautiful. Can't see the tufa very well from here. That's some of it right there. Next time. Tired last night to take photos. There's the camp spot where we had soup and popcorn, cereal, and homemade Sammys. Dr. Mears. That's the wake-up call. Time to go. It's a gorgeous little stream at Toulouse. That's the one that does the hooping. That's Claude. Oops, I'm moving around too much. Anyway, stream. That sounds nice. The only problem is snow-covered mountains. I'm finding you there. And power lines. My favorite. And they even have sound effects. But actually, it's a pretty nice campground to stop on the way to the Mojave. What a set of mountains here, huh? Try not to get the mirror in here. Oops, signpost. Okay, getting ready to cross the Mojave River, I think. Everybody loaded in the back.
Hey now!
Oh yes!
Oops.
So this is you doing your real US thing, isn't it really?
we had the three monkeys.
I was wonderful. Are you going to get the
monkey?
Oh, you're
No, I'm going to sit on the back.
Oh.
Cover your mouth.
I was like, I had to look.
See which monkey you are. Okay, we're going to go across the Mojave River here.
I've seen the feature more card.
And I'm going to pull in because I understand we get sprayed.
Oh, yes.
Concentrate.
Okay, he's coming down. I understand he's going to go through the and up here's the cheering crowd. This is Afton Canyon. Is this beautiful? Look at formations. I'm going to go into the sun. Gorgeous. Just gorgeous.
I'm sorry, Alistair. I understand.
That's okay.
That's okay, they can stop.
And just a bit of beautiful flowers that look like they're coming in. Again, a lot of reflection off the light, but against the gravel, they're beautiful. Lots of green color this time of year. And there's the Mojave River flowing through. Side we have the yellow. Oh, and look up above.
You may have to replace them all the time, so these are initially more expensive.
Gorgeous wildflowers this year.
Last a lot longer.
And we're running right along the railroad tracks. And Claude promised a train. We'll get that. This is more of the color. Back on there. Kind of bouncy. I don't know if this will take too well. Just a little bit more.
Look at the way it's fluted over there. It looks like the feet on the Sphinx.
Balls on toes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I should stop.
That's all right. That's all right. If it... Yes.
Are you still in one piece there?
Yes.
To follow this down,
I love
we've
it.
come along the railroad.
There's not much going on, but please also be cautious because every once in a while stones come rifling down from the top. There's not much you can do about that except keep your eyes and ears and wits about you. It's relatively safe. So I don't have any qualms about us going in there, up there. We're just going to let you do your walk up there and observe and enjoy. And when you come back here, we'll talk a little bit about that after we hear Noel's presentation.
The way into Afton Canyon. Whoop. Oh, wanted a bit of the perspective, so I'll back up again.
Is the van open?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, my glass is white.
Let's get an idea. Dr. Mears. Keisha.
That would be nice.
See the size? Once again, another spot.
That is the coolest camera. To be able to see what it looks like.
And up in through here and around. Students. This is all going back over my head. Almost completely behind me. Can't hear him. I'm going to turn around slowly. This is looking straight up. Coming back around. Getting down into the narrows. You can see how much narrower it's getting. Following it around the corner, getting narrower and darker.
Wow, I gotta take a picture of that.
Look up.
Oh, wow.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. See if I can see it here. There's light shining through. And here it is where we're at.
That's what I had to do, is sneak up on them and just go, hey, Flash.
I don't think anything will show, but there are people coming out here. As you can hear, there's one face.
It's only 2 feet.
It's pretty nice. It's very cool. But you can't say anything. Janet! I am actually. Since you mentioned it.
Someone just take a photograph of it.
You're gonna have it. These are gonna be great. Oh my God, they're coming out. Yeah, they're coming.
Okay.
You need is a
Don't get mad, get even. That's
You can find the,
This is amazing.
I don't know where it is. I can't find it. Cannot find the light. Nope. Oh, there it is. Way back in here. And once again, and just, I think at the very end,
Okay,
the light.
oh, this is the end of it.
No, it goes farther.
Come on, David.
Okay, I'll try to orient you to where we are right now. I might need a little bit of help with this, but to the south of us, which I believe is this way, are the Katy Mountains. You probably saw them when we were driving in. And then to the northeast is Cave Mountain, and then just slightly below that, like east-northeast, is the Mojave River wash, and beyond that, Soda Lake, which is now dry. And they thought, from what I read, they believed that this region in general was developed over long periods of time from ancient episodes of uplift and erosion, some volcanism, some faulting and folding, and then the actual canyon itself. And this is a gorge off of the canyon, right? The canyon itself is right out here. The canyon itself was formed by the rapid drainage of an ancient lake called Lake Mannix, which was to the west of us. And they believe that there was an earthquake or some shifting of faults along the Mannix Fault, which runs northeast across the canyon. And that's what caused the river, or the lake, to start to drain. And it was pretty rapid, and it formed the canyon here. We are out of the National Preserve, so we're no longer under the purview of the National Park Service. BLM manages this area, and I don't know when their offices were established in this area, but apparently sometime in the late 70s, some people were out over here looking at the canyon and thought, wow, this doesn't look so hot. Maybe we can restore it and bring it back to something that sort of resembles pre-contact, pre-European American contact canyon. But they weren't real sure what that was. Apparently, from what I read, the canyon was just clogged with tamarisk. So they didn't even know what kind of vegetation should be here. So they started looking through these old journals, and they found one from 1775. There was a priest by the name of Francisco Garces, who was supposedly the first European who came through here. And he kept a pretty good journal and noted some of the primary dominant vegetation in the area. So they knew that the canyon should have cottonwoods and willows and mesquite as part of the riparian vegetation. And then there's a second community of vegetation, which they term the creosote scrub bush. And that's what we saw when we came in. It was primarily creosote with some things like brittle bush and burrowed brush and, brushy, scrubby kind of thing. So in 1980, they decided that this area should be called an area of critical environmental concern. And that title sort of affords it some forms of protection. And then in 1989, they wrote a management plan where they wrote down all their goals and what they wanted to do and how they were going to do it. And one of the primary things was to remove the tamarisk. There were some burrows in the area. They wanted to remove the burrows. And let me define the area itself was 300 acres of just the riparian area that spanned 2 miles, a stretch of 2 miles of the Mojave River. They wrote the management plan, and then I guess it took them a couple years to get some funding or whatnot and personnel. And then in 1992, they actually came up, rolled up their sleeves, and started chopping away the tamarisk and removing the burrows and doing what they could. The report that I read said that in 1992 there was 1 cottonwood tree left in the canyon within that 300-acre area. And there were about a handful, 5, 6, 7, 10 willows and mesquites. And they were all very stressed and dying. So they removed the tamarisk, they planted lots of native vegetation. They claim now that there are hundreds of cottonwood trees, although I haven't seen any. And that there are hundreds of willows and mesquites. So they're feeling pretty positive about what they're doing. Of course, they're far from finished. They have a lot to do yet. But they're feeling pretty positive. We're on the lower third half of the Mojave River. There are only 3 places where the Mojave River runs above ground, and this is one of them. It's a stretch, literature says 4 to 6 miles, but obviously it's just a trickle. So that's what I think I know. Do you have any questions?
Questions or comments? I believe you said that they used herbicides on the tamarisk, is that correct?
Yeah, from what I could determine, they initially got rid of it by cutting it and burning it, and then they tried to control it by herbicide application so that it wouldn't regrow. And they say that they had about a 95% success rate of keeping that out.
I think there's also a lot of arrowweed. Was that mentioned in any research you did?
I didn't see anything about it.
It looks to me like there's arrowweed in here, which is a long, tall, straight stalk that was used for making of arrows by the indigenous folks.
I don't know.
Okay, so you know where that
Yeah, I'm sorry, do you know?
What was the
Is
question?
this part of the 300-acre area? Are we?
Oh, right over here, but past the dams.
Okay, so we are in the area that
This
they are
specifically would not be.
actively restoring. Oh, just a couple of notes of interest, I'm sorry.
So the water that we see out there, is this the entire water, or is the most of the water also underneath, underground?
Subsurface water.
Just a couple of notes of interest. In the 1800s, this was called Cave Canyon. My guess would be because of gorges like this. And this area is also called the Grand Canyon of the Mojave Desert because of the colored rocks.
How important it is looking at material and making some deductions about what the material tells you about its origins. So what does the material tell you about its origins? What was its geological, geomorphological history and what you can see?
Sediment?
Well, it's sedimented and layered, so that tells you it was...
Didn't come very far.
So it's sedimented, so it's waterborne in some way, most probably.
Didn't travel very far.
It didn't, well, how do you know that?
It's very angular.
Extremely angular, so we have no water around it. So what deduction can we make about that also? On the very high energy conditions.
And wherever it was transported from wasn't very far away.
Exactly.
I mean,
So what we've got here are materials which were laid under very short, sharp, high energy events. Very obviously similar to the sort of flash flood conditions we still experience. And it was a fairly rapid development of this material. Now I don't know enough about the actual geography of this, but this seems to me like in a whole area which has been infilled by a whole area of lake bed into which these materials were deposited.
Yeah.
Right. Lake bed's farther upstream from where we are now.
But these are also alluvial materials and sedimentary materials. That
Right, but
intrigues me.
they wouldn't necessarily have been deposited in that
No.
Lake Mannix. So there may be
Clearly these are. And this is obviously a very concentrated high energy system which has to keep pace with the more powerful Mojave River. So as the Mojave River itself is base leveling and eroding its base, this storm channel has cut down because as the base level of the Mojave diminishes, so this stream has to be in fact cut down. And we've had therefore this very remarkable canyon cut by this smaller, ephemeral stream trying to keep pace with the greater power of the Mojave.
How stable is it?
Well, that's the other thing. And so when you've got in arid conditions very steep down cutting along the line of erosion of the river flow, the canyon sides remain largely untouched because of its high arid conditions. In circumstances of more fluvial landscapes, these would simply be gradually eroded by soil creep, runoff, and they would gradually, of course, have a reduced slope gradient.
So when you
The
came
fact
here
that they're
last year,
steep is because it's an arid environment.
so when you came here last year, it was raining?
No, when we were here last time, it was a very, very high wind.
Uh-huh.
And the wind itself was dislodging pebble after boulders.
Small,
It
small,
was very
small.
dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
Too dangerous.
Just
But along with what John's saying, look at the boulders in the stream channel from this tributary. Can you imagine those boulders being moved by water? They have been, probably, unless the bulldozer shoved them up there. But even as we went up the canyon, you saw large boulders, right? So at times, this thing is very, very competent in its own right.
Yeah.
Nikolai.
Well, John, you said it happened really, really fast in geologically time.
In geologic time, it's
How fast?
a very young ephemeral feature. Sorry?
How fast will it be? 10,000 years?
Well, Lake Mannix was the end of the Pleistocene.
15,000 and 19,000 years ago.
Yeah, 15,000. That's just the end of what we would see as the end of the Pleistocene. So the emptying of Lake Mannix created the Mojave Gorge, or the canyon here. And subsequent to that, these smaller tributaries have been creating this system of very narrow access points for these tributary draws or washes.
But that's only coincidental in this case. You could find a situation like this that was much, much older. That's not the time frame. The time frame is how long it takes to deposit this. So you could have this could have happened 15 million years ago in some other place, or below us.
Through the wildflowers, in amongst the boulders. I don't know what those are. Uh-oh, gotta hurry and catch up with the brook.
My propose is that we go, and if we see photos that need to be taken, we spend time.
It's an incredible place. Afton Canyon. This is the other side of the canyon.
Ready?
The river. Mojave River. I'm going to step out and it may... No, it's going to, but this is still beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Sizes. It's sizes. It's sizes. Sizes. It's sizes. It's sizes. Oh, there it is. Oh, sizes. Oh, sizes. Oh, sizes. Right? Oh, there it is. Sizes. Tomorrow. Oh, sizes. 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 What's it called? Sizes. What's it called? Sizes. How do you spell it? Give me a C. Give me a Isaac! Oh, yeah! Woo! Isaac! 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 Woohoo! Isaac! Isaac! Oh, Isaac! Oh, yeah! Oh, Isaac! Oh, it's Isaac! It's Isaac! It's Isaac! It's Isaac! To the right. You can't see on the left. Uh-huh. It's Isaac. Over on the right. Oh, yeah. But if you look to the left, oh, yeah, you cannot see to the right. Oh, it's Isaac. Oh, it's Isaac. Is it? Oh, no. Oh, yes. Is it in Texas? Oh, no. Alaska. Oh, no. Connecticut? Oh, no. California. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. California. Can you see the big C? Oh, yeah. It's Isaac. Oh, yeah. It's Isaac. Yeah. It's Isaac.
I'll disorient you. You know where you are? Table Mountain over here. Ooh, that's the castle. Right, to the left. Castle Dome, I think. Castle Dome Mountains and the Castle Rocks to the left. And the Landfair Valley across that sweeping plain. And we'll work our way eventually over to the base of these rocks, and we'll have some folks talk there. But those rocks down there is a perfect circle of stone. We don't know where it is.
I thought this morning it's over there. I'm watching.
Oh. Okay, Chris.
I feel so proud that I happened to see it.
That's not it. There's one more. See, you all went for the big Easter egg instead of walking out through there.
This isn't what we're looking for.
You're going to have to work your way, spread out after we get through here. Spread out and work your way back.
We're looking for a large circle of stone, huh?
Is this larger than the...
No, it's about half. Just talk a little bit about these forms. Let Christy... Oh.
I know.
I had to step on it.
That's fine.
And Steve, any comments you wish to make? And then we'll ask John Bentley to talk a bit about this and the erosional cycle. John, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, Christy, you're on.
Well, you guys all are sitting on the Teutonia batholith. And a batholith is just a big, I can't say that word, a big, humongous series of plutons. How's that? Essentially a bath, let me tell you, about during the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs were still roaming around, there were many intrusions under a large mountain chain similar to the Cascade Mountains. So not only above there were these giant Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainiers, but underneath them there were granitic intrusions, the roots of the mountains. Much of the preserve, this is called the Teutonia batholith. And eventually by the end of the Mesozoic, when the dinosaurs were doomed and into their lives, the mountains, the volcanoes, were all eroded down to sort of a plain, but the batholith still remained underneath. And during the Basin and Range period, many of these mountain roots, starting about 20 million years ago, were uplifted and since then have been kind of falling apart. And so we're sitting on part of the Teutonia batholith. And a batholith needs to be about over 100 square kilometers to be a batholith. Before that, it's just a pluton. And it's made up actually of 6 different kind of granitic magmas, or plutons. And they're very pretty. And that's my story.
Okay, thank you. Steve, anything to add?
Well, you know, you notice how all these rocks are more or less rounded? This is called spherical weathering. And if you look on the ground, you'll see these really fine granitic soils. Well, these soils come from these rocks. As these are weathered, the outer edges are eroded away, and we get nice rounded forms. It's caused by just water wearing away the edges, getting in the cracks and crevices, and when water gets cold it freezes and it breaks it apart, and it wears away at the outermost extremities of the rock. And as this stuff sloughs off, it piles up. We have beautiful granitic soils. They call decomposed granite in Ashland. It is formed very much the same way. There's minerals in these granites. Some are softer than others, and they erode more easily, and that's why you get the rounded edges. And it makes for an impressive landscape.
Landscape, thinking what it will.
Carruthers Canyon.
Blah, blah, blah. No. John?
We were again, but if you see the different patterns, they go one way and then the other. You can imagine the intrusion of the magma. There are different episodes of intrusion of molten material, and that's why you get that very arrangement of the jointing pattern in here. A lot of exfoliation you'll find some pedestal rocks, larger blocks within the pattern of jointing that have remained underneath them. They've been weathered away, and therefore pedestals. Well, you'll see a lot of interesting features. You'll see a lot of oak vegetation and other trees as you go up in here. Juniper is in here also. And if you go up the canyon,
All right, there they go, trying to find ways up the mountain. And by the mountain, this is mountains.
I mean, I don't like to say that, but Tom is right.
These
Jump, go, follow the tree. Yeah. Look out, friends. Yeah. Oh, you're not here.
and there they go.
Just lost her. Finding gone.
And this is the way up. What's the name of this creek? Carruthers Creek?
Could be, I don't know. You could probably look on that gate station.
Here's the backside of that mountain that they have begun to climb. Part of it anyway. And the stream that we're following. And Anne's feet. There's some we've spotted. There they are. Some of them made it.
Wave!
Oh, so you know where they're at. And there's another over there. I think I can spot him. I don't know. Can we see him? Yes, there he is.
landscape. It is a forest climax vegetation. We now have less than 5% of our country which is in fact tree covered. The whole of our, and that's mainly of course planted. So we have totally modified our landscape. But we do have these places which were set aside for their natural beauty. The second object was to maintain areas of access for recreation. And the third one was to make sure that those who lived in the national parks could maintain a proper economic livelihood. So those are the principles. And of course what we were saying is that we were providing a form of planning protection for already occupied areas. And remember also that they are privately owned areas. There is no federal land in the way in which you can use that term here. We don't have land owned by the government. And so our national parks are planning committees who seek by guidance to ensure that change is not at the cost of the beauty or the quality, as it's seen, of those environments. What has happened, of course, since that 1949 Act, that the national parks have become increasingly popular. And take just one of the larger national parks, which is around about just under 400 square miles. A pinprick as far as you're concerned. But the Peak District National Park, which is in the centre of the country, is surrounded by a population within an hour's drive of something like 30 million people, all within an hour's drive of the centre of the park. And so the pressure on our parks is enormous. And in fact, one of the sort of statements that is used, in fact, that the success of the national parks is their greatest failure. Of course, we're now beset with problems of what we do with those who drive up in all their, and they're always driving cars now. Where do you park the cars? Where do you feed them? Where do you provide the tourist facilities? And more particularly, how do you repair the damage that all those feet do to the footpaths and the byways? And so our national parks are intensely used places of recreation in which people still have the right to own their land, to develop it and use it as they wish, and to make a living. And this is used in Britain. And the only sort of developments we're now faced with, of course, is we've simply in the last 2 years, the last 10 years, added just 2 more national parks to the system. Besides the 10 originals, they've recently developed a national park in what is called the Norfolk Broads in East Anglia. And the Norfolk Broads are an area of open waters and marshways. And their origins, it's a national park which is based upon 16th century peat diggings. And when peat has been removed, the diggings flooded, and over the succeeding 400 years there has been a magnificent development of an ecosystem totally as a creation of the activity of society. Yet to us it is a treasured national park. The other national park, which is, for those of you who come to the field trip that I hope we can arrange at some point, it's just on the western side of Winchester, is the National Park of the New Forest. And the New Forest is not a forest. It's an open hunting range which was part of the royal hunting parks of the 10th and 11th century. And so for many hundreds of years it was king's property, and people were prevented from making permanent settlements. Although they did have what were called common approach to environment, is culturally bound. It's bound by circumstance of the society. But I think in both of them there is this sense of what is it about nature, about the outdoors. What is it, the romantic, is it atavistic? What draws us to these don't know for you, but for me, these are places of great emotion. I enjoy being in them, and I just think they're marvelous places. And of course it's, out of many American writers, has come the statement, of course, and it's particularly Thoreau who said, in wilderness is the preservation of the world.
I'm going to rub this really quick after we're done and snap one, okay? So
Can I get you one?
it's not a timer, but I just want to... Oh, you want me to get one? Okay, well then no one can move after this. Has everybody got a... Who's going to grab a camera?
Yep. Okay, go everyone in.
Stick it out.
Stick it out. Say, what do we say?
These are the cinder domes.
Oh no, it was Africanized bees.
That's everyone. And those are the lava flows over there. Oops.
Okay. Hey, Sarah.
Perspective.
The middle of the desert and had built a health spa and resort and a radio station and sort of a radio evangelist and doctors out in the middle of nowhere. And that always fascinated me. So when I was trying to figure out what I would shoot, size 6. Oh yeah. Size 6, here we go. Oh yeah. Size 6, here we go.
This is Soda Lake, Soda Springs. Soda Lake?
Soda Lake. Dry Soda Lake.
And there's John overlooking the scene here.
Would you like to show them the resort we've been staying in? These were our overnight accommodations. It's so much fun. You know, just had to sweep out the haunted, diseased rodents.
Anything of interest in there?
This haunted, diseased air.
The old resort in action.
It's where we've been sleeping for the last week.
Too bad. Government takeover. This is really an enormous place. You can see the mountain. The wind's blowing really hard today. All the dust is up. The remnants of a once great resort.
Hey, it's Wilbur.
Yeah. I wish.
Casey, did you see the cross? I thought it was the building.
One of the pools. Ponds, I guess you'd say. And fish or not.
Look at the fish down here. And this guy right here, he keeps diving, going down, getting stuff off the bottom.
Does he?
It's really
It's the wonderful 7 or 8 seconds.
The resort, which is now an extension of the University for private studies. Looks like an elder hostel here. One of our beautiful lizard specimens.
Come on.
There they are.
Hey.
How long has this been a snake den here?
Well, how do you... Oh. Here is almost the peak of Teutonia Peak, overlooking the valley and almost on the very top of Sima Dome. It's kind of right in the sun, sorry. There's our British friend. Say hello.
Hello, Anne and Co.
Thank you. Some more coming up. Great view.
No Burger King?
Well, maybe one. Not even like more interpretive.
I hope that you can get this. This is Sima Dome. Very rounded, volcanic batholith. Here's even higher up the peak. But I thought this was a great view of Sima Dome. Oh yeah, that might help. Okay, here we are at the very top of Teutonia Peak. I'm in. There's some guys, I don't know if you can see it, it's probably shining right in the light. There's some of the guys. This is the beautiful valley. It's very windy. It's beautiful. About to give you a 365-degree view. Those are really beautiful. This is a rock outcropping at the top of Sima Dome, the big batholith. There's some more of our guys. This is looking down where I'm at. It's kind of a rocky ledge. Now we can zoom in. On some people walking, I saw them. But I may not be able to find them. So, anyway, there's the beautiful valley. Goodbye. Just a note to Mom. I just want you to know that I have had a really great time with you this week. It's been a great experience. I hope that you have liked it as much as I did, and I love you, and thank you. Bye.
Good for you.
I couldn't have slept on it tonight. You know, that soda lakes, Isaac, the dust flying around.
Yes, I ate a lot of
I know. I'm all digging out my nose. I'm like,
I don't know. Just in case. A little bit of the fire.
course, but yeah, I'd just like if you get marked, it kind of forces you to, yeah, to be more, you know. My Bonnie lies over the sea. In fact, my Bonnie is alive.
I noticed they came by and took John's sticker off of his post today.
Oh, I say, that's not very festive.
Great. So what you have...
It's kind of a compliment and an honor both to have our visitors with us for the second year. John Bentley has been here for the third time, third offense. We're glad to have you folks here, and I'm reminded of the welcome that Claude gave last year, soon after the nine arrived from England in this campground. And Claude saying, you've come over 7,000 miles, traveled through places like Las Vegas, came across the desert into the heat from the green country. I think is he getting something to hit me with? Just scaring so it doesn't kill us. And saying, you know, we really appreciate what you've done and coming here, the trials and tribulations that you've come through. And John Bentley turns to him and says, but of course, we're English. Mad dogs in English. Anyway, I welcome you all here to this gathering on Friday. I don't know what the date is, but it's Friday end of the day. 30th of March. At approximately 35 degrees north latitude, 115 degrees west longitude. That's approximately where we are. A little bit south for all of us. West. And you're not here for me. I don't know what the order will be.
Shall I tell you?
Go ahead.
Shall I start now, or you can?
Go ahead. Floyd, you're on.
Yes, what we're going to do is, I suppose we're going to try to talk ourselves for just a few minutes. We've spent however many days it is listening to the things that you know, most of which are things that we don't know about at all, and we've listened with stunned amazement in my case, to and sort of accessed a world of knowledge that was quite unknown, certainly to me, obviously not to my venerable colleague, but certainly to me. And so we increasingly felt that actually we wished that we had come with talks too, so that we could share our thoughts, research and so on with people at different places. But we're catching up. Now is when we're catching up. So what we've done is we've just thought about what we know and what we would like to say about the experiences that we've had this week. And so I'm going to start, and then the KAC students will talk separately about their different reflections. And then, will it be you then, John?
Yes, I'll say so.
Yes, and then finally, climactically, it will be Alistair. So, yeah. So, I'll start. I'm afraid I've been terribly impressed by people this week standing up and giving forth without notes to everybody on a mountain in the wind, and often making fabulous gestures at the same time. I've been struck down because I can't tell somebody to turn the light off at the beginning of a lecture without having it written down first. So I'm afraid it's written down. The only thing about when things are written down, you know how long you've got for people to talk. So I've got 2 pages of this, so that's how long you've got to listen to me. So my theme that I've thought about as I've listened to you, and I've listened to various people talking in the last few days, works around a cluster of movement words: travel, tour, trip, vacation. And we've been, it seems to me,
surrounded, inspired, and sometimes even oppressed, for me anyway, by images, evidences of movement. And so I want to talk about my train of thought in relation to travel and movement. In my field, cultural studies, cultural history, we've often thought of travel as inextricably bound up and implicated in the work of expansion, appropriation of land, and indeed with picking things, with gathering, with collecting, with all those activities of specifying, codifying, the activities of subjecting the landscape to our knowledge. We often think in cultural studies of this rather dark tradition of travel, at its darkest perhaps, when we're thinking about moving into the wilderness, the so-called wilderness. But what I've noticed this week, more than anything else, is with what concentration and at times with what passion we've bent our efforts to making our surroundings here understandable, comprehensible. You geographers, geologists, and all the other things that you are, seem to me to have an extraordinary set of tools at your disposal that you use to give this landscape shape. Others of us have found ourselves much more casting around to find a way of understanding where we are this week. Just small things to the extent of simply putting our forefingers on unfamiliar maps in the attempt to work out, in any sense, where we are, mining our memories for knowledge that we've gained in quite different contexts that we could bring to bear on this space. And yet, I think even as we've tried to do these things in our separate and more or less successful ways, we are reminded, I think, of the ways in which our knowledge fails to encompass what we see and feel in a place like this. I've spent the last few years, I call it few, I think it's probably more than few, writing about female emigrants to the West. I've spent it reading diaries, letters, journals handed down, autobiographies unpublished and published. And I've written a book that draws these writings together. But this week has been, in many ways for me, quite an uncomfortable reminder of all that I haven't understood about that process of emigration, all that I've left out, and most especially what it is, what it always was, to be in a landscape such as this for the first time. If that has been an extraordinary and at some level, at least for me, disturbing experience in terms of our work, it's also been this week for me equally interesting in opening up another equally puzzling world of questions. This week has seen us, has it not, engaging in the most elaborate movements, planned and unplanned, puzzling and understood. We've been travelling exotics indeed, but as we've talked, asking each other frequently about our lives, we've also continually referred to past travels, past migrations, until it seems that we ourselves experience and have experienced layer on layer of movement as we gaze at this moving landscape, where names are short-lived, where places disappear, where settlements survive only because they correspond with forms of movement, where the desert itself is apparently continuously in transit. This compulsive series of histories of movement seems to me to have as its consequence disappearance. At Goff's schoolhouse, Dennis K. Spear, a man whose own life has been characterized by the most dramatic shifts in place and occupation, this man works endlessly to try to recover a narrative of community, a story of a network of relationships that may have been stable even if only over a few decades. But if he thinks, or if he feels, or maybe if he has actually found a true story, a way of accessing a community, there's no key, it seems, to unlock the significance of, for example, that list of teachers that he's made. Young women interviewed in San Bernardino, trained who knows where. Young women who, with a few exceptions, left teaching at Goffs after only a year. The Friends of the Goffs Museum too, the Mojave Road project, have sought to pull together a history of community by literally dragging a series of objects together to form a museum, striving to recreate this lost world. As I looked at that list of teachers, and as I looked at that collation, that strange miscellany of objects at the schoolhouse, they seemed to me just to recall the absence of those whose activity gave each object meaning. So what we take from this trip, diaries in particular, is all that we may have to remind us of these movements that we have undertaken this week, and of course our own fleeting encounter. Diaries to be stored first of all in the faculty, then at home, then in drawers, then in cupboards, finally in attics and boxes, traces of our encounter for other people to find. And in the meantime, we will retell our adventures together over the next week. We will narrate them in stories with high points and endings at other gatherings than these. We will embroider and reshape them with each telling, with each memory, in the marvellously imaginative and creative way that we have. And our stories will be recalled perhaps by others and linked with their similar or similarly imagined experiences. And when those experiences are found, those diaries are found, they will no doubt be as vivid and as elusive and at times as troubling as the story of contact and community that I'm going to finish by reading. It's a little account of a fleeting encounter that occupies itself a margin in Casebeer's book, collected from a newspaper published elsewhere, from an occasional column of news about Goffs, written by someone whose name we don't know, a brief, tantalizing, evocative story of an encounter something like ours. From our regular correspondent, 2nd of November, 1922. On the night of October the 28th, everyone at or near Goffs enjoyed a delightful time at a dance given by the young men of Goffs at the schoolhouse. All wore masks until 10 o'clock, when the floor manager, Walter Ordway, ordered that masks be removed, thus revealing the identity of the maskers. The prizes given for the best costumes were 2 boxes of cigarettes and a box of candy, which were awarded to Alex Fernandez, dressed as a Fatima of the Egyptian harem, Arthur Wells as a Spaniard, Mrs. Thompson as a pickaninny. At a late hour, the luncheon was served, consisting of sandwiches, cake and coffee. All those who attended report having had a most delightful time. That's it.
Talking about my first impressions of the campsite and also of America, because I don't know if a lot of you know that this is my first trip, so my perspective is kind of different to the rest of the friends and the lecturers and everything. So here goes. One of the first things that struck me definitely about Mojave was the variety of the landscape. I come from south of England, and we've got a lot of beaches, and we've got a bit of forest, but we don't have the diverseness you have here, and we're all lucky to see really. And I think the first impression I had of Mojave again is from Christy. I don't know if you'll remember, we were driving along one of the paths and we saw this mad woman running in a blistering hot day. She was just running along by our coach and she was just waving and smiling. And we're like, oh my God, does she want a lift? Is she alright? I was just mesmerised, you know. I wouldn't do it, but that's, there you go. You always have a very significant role in my heart. And basically, yeah, like I said, the extreme conditions. Right. I kind of feel that as a group you'd like to get away from the hustle and bustle of your everyday life, from mobile phones, from the internet, from, I suppose really from television, and you all sort of remind me, like Janet said, of the Case Beer family. You know, you want to get away from everything, you want to go back to your ground roots. I think we as British tend to sort of forget where we come from and we just take it for granted what lovely space we've got. But if you live in a council estate and you never see the sea, it's something you always want to see, but I just see it every day and it just passes me by. And one thing which you all kind of did for me was add a sense of uniqueness. I've only been camping once, and that was last year, and we ate baked beans and we had a little stove, and there was people trying to sort of cook for about 5 of us, and here you've got solar powered showers, you've got cupboards full of food, you've got gourmet chefs, you've got the simple things like a deck chair. We had to squat on blankets and occasionally a pillow, and I think you probably all take it for granted how different this is for me. Definitely different. I think myself, I haven't rehearsed this very well, that you all kind of, like I said, want to get away from the life and connect to the environment, which is why you hike on your own. You hike for hours and hours at a time, and I don't, basically. I'm losing form here, but definitely connecting with the land, wanting to be a part of the land and the wilderness, away from life, away from mundane existence. Can I be like that here? I'll go on to Rihanna now, who can probably express what she feels a lot better than me. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just want to point out that this is based on impressions. I don't know in detail the things I'm talking about. It's all based on impressions and things that you lot have said, and if I get things wrong, correct me, and you know, that's good. But what I was planning to talk a bit, because this interested me most, was the contradictory conservation policies I was sort of seeing, and they weren't necessarily outright contradictory, but just the contradictory actions that were going on in relation to the environment. My first impressions upon arriving here in our talk was the big drive for conservation, how you can't remove a rock, you can't take things away, you can't, you know, change what's already here any more than it's already been changed. And in relation to that, how you're, after a return to the wilderness, I can't remember, I'm sorry, who did the talk in Ashland Canyon, but about how they want to get rid of the tamarisk and get rid of the stuff that was brought in and return it to the natural and the original environment, and things like that, how the drive to protect tortoises, even the refurbishing and bringing to life of deserted towns such as Goths and Kelso Depot, how they want to refurbish them. I mean, obviously Goths is being refurbished and Kelso, there are plans to. It struck me that the land here had a big meaning to people because of this want to return to the wilderness. And this raised some questions for me, because obviously, as you know, we all flew into Las Vegas. And Las Vegas, compared to here, well, doesn't get any more different. There's just flashing lights, there's just complete overabundant use of the water, of energy, as if there, you know, is a vast cornucopia of it out there for you to use, and that there's no need to hold back. And in fact, there's obviously not, because we visited the Hoover Dam, and I think I was talking to John a bit when I was there, and about how it's not going to last forever, and how it is actually going to, you know, be used up, and at that point something's going to need to be changed in order for people to carry on living in Las Vegas and around there. And it just made me think as well, because the Hoover Dam is actually quite destructive to the landscape. On one side, storing up the sediment, and on the other side, the super pure water damaging the bed as it goes down. And I'm not too sure about how that all works and things like that, so I won't go into that too much. But it also struck me that you have a fight against the recreation visitors who have as much right to come here as we all do, but they just don't know how to appreciate the land in the same way or recognise the way it needs to be protected in the same way. And you can't turn around and say, no, don't come here, because then somebody could say, no, don't come here to us. Obviously we want to. It also made me think about the contrast in England, where I think it was Janet or John, somebody saying about the cultural history there, that the buildings, everything is part of our cultural history. We don't want to go back to before we were there. I mean, for a start, that'd be very hard to do because England's much smaller. There's much more many of us. Bad English. And so, in fact, it's actually quite difficult for us to go back and have a piece of land that we can call wilderness, because it is really impossible. But, I mean, we still have our attempts to preserve what we have, and we have listed buildings. But our listed buildings can include a gross 1960s tower block, council estate tower block, because that's part of who we are. We don't want to get rid of that and return that area to what it was. We want to keep that and say, look, this is part of our cultural history. And coming here, it was very much about getting rid of the traces of what we've made, which I thought was interesting. I mean, I did have a little theory on how people reacted to the land, and how, you know, we did the homesteading act in the plains, and how people came to the plains and they tried to farm the land, and it was actually very difficult, but they persisted because land, if it wasn't being used, wasn't useful, and that kind of theories going on. So what I concluded, that there was a binary opposition going on between conservation and progress, and conservation and existing in an area, because, you know, perhaps without the Hoover Dam we wouldn't be able to visit here because we need the water just as much as the people of Las Vegas. We couldn't be here without having water supplied to us in the same way that they can't be there. And it's just about how, about how it's very difficult to know where you go from here. And it must be quite an awkward place for everyone, because you want to preserve it, but you want to keep coming out here. And how do you think about the future? Because once the energy and water provided by the Hoover Dam and places like that is gone, what happens to Las Vegas, and what happens to people that want to come out here and visit? And, you know, just thoughts like that. There you go.
Because of thoughts I've been having since being here, like Las Vegas being plunked in the middle of a desert. Unpractical it is in a way, in terms of water. And also coming out here and seeing the contrast of how it's such wilderness and such, well, just so different from the urban America. Yeah, I just noticed how, well, I'll carry on from where I went to anyway. Okay. I've noticed just how harsh an environment in Mojave in the West can be. When contemplating, especially when contemplating extreme heat and the rugged landforms, etc., etc. I was really impacted about how people could move along this kind of landscape with the heat and the lack of water and over this kind of landscape. And I just thought, especially since they don't have any vehicles, or they'd rather have vehicles but not in the same sense as we do, and not the same equipment as we have. So it must have been incredibly hard how they managed to cross such a harsh environment. Then I remembered a paper by Frederick Jackson Turner, which was written in 1893, entitled The Frontier Thesis. He basically spoke about how the movement of the frontier helped to create aspects of American identity. For example, when people arrived in environments such as this, what we're camping in, they perhaps had to change and adapt in order to survive and live more comfortably. So they had to change to, you know, survive, like I said. Therefore, it perhaps it seemed to Turner that these Americans that came across the frontier and settled had to change and then created a separate identity away from a more European kind of identity like you might find in the East more. So that makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it does. Anyway, to conclude, all week we have been learning about how humans have affected this landscape and environment, but for example, like Sarah was talking about how the off-road vehicles are destroying the soils and stuff like that. Although this is a precious truth that needs to be held on to, it seems that the relationship can go both ways. Perhaps this environment that we've been in has played a great part in the development of American culture and society. And that's it.
That's been most useful to me on this trip is looking at it in respect of a class we did last year on looking at the West and westward expansion and things like that. Especially looking at the concept of manifest destiny, which was a key to understanding the westward expansion, and just looking at the hugeness and powerfulness of the landscape which we see around us here, which I probably hadn't really appreciated before, although I've been to America before, just seeing it in a wilderness state, indicating the idea of, well, as they saw a powerful country, and giving pioneers sort of a motivation to go out west, which I think has kind of really been illustrated to me this week as being the amazing mountain ranges, just the huge expanses of land. And moving on from that, I was thinking about the concept of the West as it was seen as a place to, I think Tom kind of touched upon it, as a place to test people and a place of challenge. And I really think that's been borne out really even down to us this week, you know, having to scramble all over the rocks and really exert yourself physically, working against this heat and, you know, the conditions we find ourselves. It's interesting that that's still relevant today, that, you know, it's not something that's just in the past, that, you know, it still is a challenge out here, that I've definitely found it challenging, and, you know, I really feel it's done something for me personally. I think it's interesting that we tend to think of, when we're learning about it in class and looking at it in theory, we think of really the wilderness, I suppose, as something in the past that people had to come up against, but, you know, to see it in action, as it were, is really interesting. And as Tom was saying, it really brought home to me the idea of, you know, how difficult it must have been for people moving out here, and how determined they must have been to work against these conditions, you know, when we have enough trouble with our air-conditioned fans and bottled water and everything, you know. I just thought, wow, you know, imagine travelling across this in a wagon, you know, with no water, with all your, you know, personal possessions, not knowing really where you were going to end up, which really kind of inspired me, and, you know, I found that very interesting to think about in context out here. I guess another thing that I think has been touched on by other people was the fact that we don't really have this opportunity in Europe, although we have, as John was saying, you know, we have our national parks. We don't perhaps have the extent of wilderness that you have here. And I can't remember who it said, but, you know, it would be very difficult. If you're camping in England, it's very difficult to die. Whereas out here, you wouldn't have to try very hard at all. You know, it's the sense that, you know, yeah, we'll try and get back to nature, but really you're within striking distance of inhabited areas. Whereas out here, you really can get back to, you know, the natural state of things. So I suppose really, one of the major things for me this week has been taking, you know, realisation that I take so much for granted. Just running water and just being able to buy things, or walk down the road or drive down the road and, you know, buy things from the shops. And I think that, you know, that's maybe not something I've experienced to such an extent before. So I think I would agree with John when he was giving his talk at Ashland Canyon now about the trip being very educational, but also kind of an emotional, personal experience. I think that's been very true for me. So
I've been left to conclude everything that's been said, and so basically I'm just going to be regurgitating what they said, but
but I'm going to be using it through an essay written by David Darlington in '96 called The Mojave. Yeah, he talks particularly about the East Mojave, but I'm going to try my best to relate it to him. I can find it down through. Right. Oh, I also want to give you a little bit of my diary as well, because the natural condition of humankind in this landscape is one of dauntedness. To define the scenery as breathtaking doesn't exactly explain how it takes a breath away. The Mojave is overwhelming both physically and psychologically, partly because of the utter absence of moisture, but largely because of the sheer visual scale. Unobscured by vegetation, displayed to the eye for tremendous distances by huge elevations and depressions, it seems a world of crystal clarity and total exposure. In its enormity, it constantly challenges you to comprehend it, to come to terms with its infinity. The curve of the Bajada against the sky may be the edge of the earth itself. Okay, that pretty much sums up my first impressions when I got here, and I know, having spoken to most of you, it's especially us guys who haven't experienced it before. That's there was a lot of adjectives. Their huge enormity just might as well be the edge of the earth. It's incredible. But he also talks about the contrast between. He actually talks about the Los Angeles basin, but it can equally be applied to Las Vegas. The artificialness of Las Vegas, and then to come somewhere like this where we've spent the whole remembrance. So I think that's a pretty good sum of what we came out for. He says, owing to its freedom from confinement, the desert kindles a kind of epiphany as a matter of course, an almost physical sense of liberation, a sudden sensual delight of being that's like nothing else. Now, as the guys were saying earlier, the reason people come out here for a reason, and that is to be pensive, to look over the landscape, and as John beautifully put the other day, listening to the wind coming through the trees, and you can hear it coming from so far away, and it's like nothing else in the world matters, and it's beautiful. And this is where I read my diary bit. I had to put this in about the Paiute Creek thing, talking about hiking through the canyon and the features that we were looking at, and I was getting small memories of GCSE geography in libs and blobs. I was fortunately incorrect most of the time, but just by the by. I couldn't believe how it was once submerged in water. How all these rocks and all this vegetation had been created through some form of water at some stage. It all just gone flying through there, and just knowing that we were walking right at the bottom of it, it just seemed incredible to me. The hike took about 3 hours. Not something I'm used to in the dry heat through the tamarisk, where I got most of my cute little bites. And after this tough battle, we broke through and ended up staring up at a rather large cliff face, one which we had to climb, unfortunately. It was an incredibly scary experience, and it was dauntingly steep. And as the first candidate, I can't remember who it was, ventured skywards, a vast amount of rocks and stones came hurtling to the ground. Next, however, it was my turn. Having seen what I faced, I gingerly took my first steps, grabbing to anything which looked remotely stable, i.e. cacti. I finally made the, as I saw it, life-threatening climb, with a bit of help from wise Claude, and took a few moments at the top to reflect on what I'd just achieved. Wow. We were overlooking this incredible canyon, but beyond that I was surprised by the huge rolling green hills. It looked like something from Jurassic Park. Unfortunately, this was not the end of the hike, but it was a thankfully pleasant journey up to the next place of interest, which I'm not going to get into. He talks about a group of people that he took to the Eastern Mojave, and he said far as the mountain ranges were concerned, they seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. Now, I thought that was a particularly wonderful quote, seeing as what we've been looking at for the whole week. Which I've got my little quotation to sum it up at the end. He says, the fortress-like ranges of the desert appear to hoard much information, yet if you probe them, ascend the alluvial fans, enter the canyons, climb over the cliffs, secrets are not readily released. There will be lizards, there will be rocks, there will be sun-baked, uncomplaining plants. In some cases there might be springs, feeding fertile riparian environments of willows and ferns. And if you're lucky, you might find an Indian petroglyph, or a glimpse of a bighorn sheep. But usually there'll just be more heat, more aridity, more infernal binding emptiness, again as we can see from my skin coloration. Mist of maze. The desert seems simply a desert, a very dry place, yet the aura of mystery persists. Says this is the essential piquancy, the visceral, perpetual sting of travel in the Mojave. Confronted by apparent openness, you find yourself unaccountably intrigued. Is the desert forthcoming or is it mysterious? Is it barren or is it full of life? Is it a realm of freedom or oppression? A place of peace or animosity? Of tranquility or insecurity? And I think, I'm just remembering a quote that Claude came out with right at the beginning of the trip, that you go away from the Mojave with more questions than you give answers.
One is a reflection on the whole activity of working in the open air, if you like, or in the environment. And that's the importance of being able to read environments. In Britain we call it reading the landscape, a cultural element. But whether you're in a cultural landscape of Britain or the more physical environment of certainly the Mojave, this emphasis we have on reading and interpreting. And I suppose the point I want to make is there is an art in looking and seeing and being a detective. And a phrase that I think I used last time, that you only see what you know. So unless you know what a bahada is, you'll never see it. Unless you have got some sense of an alluvial fan, or the importance of granular disintegration or exfoliation, all of these words actually help us to see and interpret. And so how very important it is for all of us, in a sense, to gradually accumulate the vocabulary you need to begin to read and interpret. And I know when I first came, the biggest challenge for me was to begin to grapple with the difference between the Mojave Joshua tree and the yuccas, and to begin to be able to name the cacti and the great varieties, and to also apply, of course, all that theoretical stuff that I did when I was an undergraduate doing my physical geography, to see for the first time a bahada, to recognize the impact of a playa. So that is an important part of what we've all shared. Picking up a vocabulary and using that vocabulary to see more. You only see what you know. The second point is to refer back to the question that I raised about drainage in desert environments. And I don't think this is the place to go into a great deal of detail, but I did say that one of the great challenges, I think, in the desert is to recognize the power of water and the development of drainage patterns. And I did set myself the task, as I said, of trying to identify the separate watersheds of the East Mojave and the Mojave Preserve area. And I would ask each of you perhaps sometime just to go and look at the large-scale maps and to see how far you can determine where the watersheds between the basins occur. It's quite a challenge. But more than that, also look at the actual patterns of the drainage, the network of the perennial in some cases, but mostly, of course, ephemeral streams. Those streams and surface flows that only occur after a desert storm. And certainly when you look at that in the context of the Paiute Canyon and the relationship between the Landfair Valley and the Paiute Wash, it really was in fact the question that led me to ask Claude to say, could we bring students across to sort of debate these things? And it is an intriguing challenge to interpret the drainage. Well, I said there were possibly 5 ways in which you could look at that Paiute Wash in the Landfair Valley. And as I say, I won't explain them, I'll just give you the terms or the keys. Some of you, Steve, has mentioned some of them to me already. But clearly when you look at the fact that there is a discordance between the drainage and the structure, between the scale of a stream and the relief through which it flows, it must raise questions about the geomorphological history of that area. One way, of course, of interpreting drainage patterns is to look for simply what we would call river capture. I think it was John who mentioned that one possible explanation of the fact that Paiute Creek begins across the watershed into Landfair Valley would be headwater erosion, which would lead to what we would know generally as river capture. One basin of higher energy, the Paiute Wash, being able to capture and gradually assume the drainage area of the Landfair. So there's one. Other ways in which you may find explanations for a discordance between drainage and structure is to look for the term superimposition, where in fact a drainage pattern and network has been superimposed from an overlying and now removed surface rock, where in fact therefore from one layer of rock, that layer having been removed, the drainage pattern is then implanted or placed upon an underlying different structure. So look for the term superimposition. A third possible explanation where you have a discordance in drainage is the use of the term antecedent drainage. Antecedence means that the network or stream flow or pattern preceded the structural patterns that you now witness. And I think in the area of Paiute Creek that is certainly a possibility, that the drainage pattern preceded some of the more recent and relatively young tectonic uplift movements. So antecedence is a possibility. A fourth possibility that we would always go for in Britain or in Europe, of course, is the impact of climate change. Climate change reducing, in fact, the power of stream flow when you move from a very pluvial or wet phase into an increasingly arid phase. Sometimes the drainage, therefore, is grander as the result of those earlier, wetter years, and now you would have such things as misfit streams. So climate change always has to be a factor in the analysis of fluviality. And then perhaps a related point, the fifth point that I would look for, again, you'd find it difficult to use this one in this context, but in Europe you would have the argument of glacial diversion, where because of former colder phases and the advance of quite major ice sheets and valley glaciers, they in some way impound and block the passage of flow and cause an alteration therefore to river drainage patterns, glacial diversion. Now each of those therefore could be applied to explaining why a drainage pattern is not consistent with the structure. And of course you would then have to think carefully about which of those processes or theories best fit the case that you are looking at. And clearly in the context of Mojave, some would not be part of that story because of circumstance. but the applying of observation, the identifying of features, naming, seeing what you know, and then using all this information and evidence to create a story of explanation, of deduction. And that for me is the great joy of fieldwork, and I suppose also of geography, that you are seeking to read landscapes, make interpretations of the past from the evidence that remains. We are looking at, in fact, what someone called the palimpsests of the past. The P-A-L-I-M-P-S-E-S-T-S's. Palimpsest. It's a word which in fact it comes from the old use of vellum. When you used to use vellum time after time, and you try to remove the previous writing, but you always leave little traces. Now landscapes are in fact like that. The traces of past are always present, and you try to piece those palimpsests together to create the story. And I think it's fascinating. And then the third point I want to say is there's nothing better than sharing scholarship with friends, and that's what it's been for me at this occasion, and I thank you all. I just one of my little sort of epithets and little phrases which was help to make the point clear, and it's the same idea in fact as the one I've said about you only see what you know. Well, I've had many people sort of saying semantically that's not impossible, but it is an important idea. You need to have the ability to see, and the phrase that goes with that is that sight is a faculty, seeing is an art. We've all got the faculty of sight. We can see things. But it's not simply the faculty of sight. It's this art of seeing and of interpreting. And that's what we're all about. Is that the one you meant?
That's it. Thank you, yeah.
Oh, John Bentley, told me of a trip to the Mojave Desert that he was going on, and he said that it was an interesting thing that perhaps our American studies students should do. And it was a good idea, but good ideas are a bit like the trains that we hear in the night here. You hear them and then they go away. This was one that we chased and ran after, caught. And yesterday, on the top of that peak, John turned to me and he said, well, I never actually thought we'd do it. But we did. We are here. And I felt at that moment that, yeah, that's right. And then Janet joined us too. And I felt a whole sort of cluster of things that sort of come together. My impressions of this trip are powerful, and I'm not sure I've got the words yet. So a few things. I've been to this area before on the highway, and in a sense the experience I've had has been something like that. Moving from driving through somewhere like Baker and Needles, maybe stopping for something at Taco Bell or McDonald's, to moving off the highway to coming here into an entirely different type of experience that the highway sort of allows me access to, but real access to comes in a lot of other ways. Once here I've found that the issue is what do I see, what do I hear, what do I feel? I'm most impressed by the sort of total sensory experience of it all. The way that it's measured in sort of the entirety of everything that human beings do. In terms of sight, the thing I see most of all is the sort of sheer clarity of things, and for me as a European particularly, the night sky. I come from a continent where that is impossible. I cannot see the night sky at home, anything like I can see the night sky. And that experience of just a few nights ago, everyone had gone to bed, the fire was still on, I couldn't sleep, I came here and I sat and I just lay on this bench and I looked up at the sky. Hearing, yeah, John spoke about hearing, the wind and the rustling, the sheer sort of sensory apparatus that sort of provides for us. And also, I think, the early morning sort of camp noises. The noise of breakfast starting. The noise of John and Janet rustling in their tents.
I'm glad you put it that way.
The human element of the landscape, in other words, the human element of our presence here, and the difference that our presence makes to it, and the difference that it makes to us. The land is sort of here whether we are here or not, but the landscape, as John has often made in lectures that I've heard, is in our own sense of belonging here, in our own sort of feelings. We make the land into a landscape by our presence. And that sense of feeling and the opportunities that have been provided to have the sensuous, it's the best word I can find for it, the sensuous feeling of the sun on my face and the wind on my arm, the sand in my shoes and the marks on my body, I think will stay for a long time. I think my overwhelming feeling, like a lot of other people's, is of the sheer size and the sheer scale of the environment here, the sheer immensity that we're dealing with. Within that, something that comes to me as a sort of a sense of the hidden presence of life and order. The way in which walking or driving along we will stop because something is glimpsed. The way in which walking along you see a little lizard scurrying away and suddenly you've captured something that's in this landscape. I'm struck by the contrasts to home, though to be frank with you, this camp now seems like home, and it's going to be very strange to leave it. It isn't that I don't want to diminish back home. I quite like flush toilets, but just the sort of sense of being here and feeling a sense of belonging that comes from the place, a belonging that comes from the people, has been very strong, and it's given me some things that I'm not sure that I can really express fully. I feel it very particularly in some ways in regard to the students that are here and in regard to my colleagues who in a new environment take on themselves new dimensions, and there's a sort of experience there that I hope prospers and sort of survives. What does it all mean? I don't know. There's something here that's key to the American experience, to your occupation of the land since, I guess, the 1600s. I'm struck that Claude first came here in the 1980s, and I'm interested in the changes that Claude has seen since then, and the changes, and I can use acronyms now with authority, the changes between the BLM and the NPS. And that makes me think of the future for this area and others like it. I've got a strange image of sort of coming back to this place, perhaps in 5 or 6 years, probably on my own, and sort of walking round this site and thinking, yes, that's where my tent was. That's where I stood. Over there is where we ate. Those are the toilet. Those sort of feelings I think are strong, and a sort of nostalgia for what's happened, but a sort of an anticipation for doing it again, and for sort of, as Janet tried to express, a sort of anticipation for telling it to other people, and looking at the photographs, and remembering it, and thinking about it again and again and again. This place will be here when we are gone. We go away, but the place will be here. John spoke of listening to the wind. The wind is there whether we are there to listen to it or not. And I think that sense of an environment that we occupy in the way that we have, but it survives, it endures. It seems very important to me. I'd have written more at this point, but I fell asleep while sitting over there. And I thought about, is that a bad thing? And I thought, no, it's not. It's a good thing. You fell asleep because it felt good, and because you were enjoying it. And it doesn't seem to me that there's anything wrong with it. Pleasure as a principle of education. Why shouldn't learning be pleasant? There must be some reason. I'd like to thank Claude. I'd like to thank John Mayers. I'd like to thank the students from Oregon. Thank them all very, very particularly. Thank them for the use of their facilities. Thank them for the use of their time. Thank them for the use of their vehicles. Thank them for a lot of things that would have made this trip impossible if it hadn't been for the sheer generosity of resource and the sheer generosity of spirit that we've seen over the last week. That's something that I think we feel very strongly. The students here, I hope, from England have learnt things about America that they couldn't learn from lectures or from watching television. I hope the Oregon students have learnt a few English swear words and some English expressions that they can take home with them. A lot of things here sort of strike me. You might be interested to know that the result of the Manhattan Project, which Claude spoke of, is that we will return. King Alfred's would like to become involved with this and to take this forward in the future, and we'll be having discussions about that. But the positive nature of the experience has been so strong. Along the walks that we've gone along, I've seen some things occasionally that have interested me. It's been the presence of little rocks put together to make little cairns that indicate the correct route to take, or the correct route to take, depending on the ground. What I'd like you all to do at some point in the course of today is please just take a rock, put it on there, and make a cairn. One rock for each of us. It won't survive. If I come back in 5 years, it won't be there. If I come back tomorrow because we forget something or we have to drive back from Las Vegas, it probably won't be there. But it's a sign of our presence. It's a sign of our community. It's a sign that will go away. But then, in a sense, what this landscape tells us is that ultimately everything goes away and nothing endures except the landscape itself. Thank you.